Hey everyone, so in this video I want to talk about another Stephen King book that I just read. I just finished Pet Sematary, and I have mentioned before on my channel that I want to talk about and review all the Stephen King books that I read as I read them, because I really like Stephen King as an author. There he is. And I find his books very fascinating, and I'm sure there are people out there that feel the same way. So today we're going to talk about Pet Sematary. Firstly, I'll just kind of talk about what Pet Sematary is about. It's basically about a man, a doctor, Lewis Creed. He moves to a new town because he gets a new job at a university where he's going to be like, I guess, the doctor on campus. He and his wife and his 2 children move to Ludlow, Maine. It's really hard to describe this book without giving too much away. I'm just now realizing. I mean, they move to a town and they have a house that's in front of this busy street that a lot of like big trucks drive by. And then things happen. And nearby the house, there's a pet cemetery. Close to that is also an ancient, I think, Indian or Native American burial ground called the Micmac Burial Ground that has some powers. I think that's as much as I can say about this book without giving more away. Now I'm going to talk about things that I liked and disliked about the book, and I'll try to not have too many spoilers, but there might be some spoilers now from this point until the end of the video. So far I've read Salem's Lot, It, The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon, and Pet Sematary. And then I listened to Riding the Bullet, which was an audiobook by Stephen King. Out of all of those, I feel like so far It has been the scariest one for me. But Pet Sematary was similar to Salem's Lot for me, just in how creepy it was. So I want to say that this book isn't as scary to me as It, but I do think that it scared me more than Salem's Lot, and it scared me enough that I did finish it last night, late at night, and I had to sleep with a light dimly on because the ending was a little creepy, not gonna lie. Stephen King is a really good author because of how detailed and descriptive he is. He just is able to help me as a reader imagine what he's describing very vividly. Obviously, that's like one of his greatest strengths as an author, and I'm sure a lot of people agree with that. So obviously, Pet Sematary is no different. There is a famous quote from this book, which is, "Sometimes dead is better," and that's literally on the back of the book. Stephen King has like an introduction for this book, and he wrote himself that at the time this was to him the scariest book that he's ever written. And I really like that in that introduction he explains that the quote, "sometimes dead is better," is the lesson of grief itself. I like that he wrote that because he said the alternative would probably be too much for us to handle, which to me the alternative would be what happens in this book, which again, maybe I won't go into that too much, because if you haven't read the book, then I don't want to spoil it for you. But I love interpreting this book from that perspective because I feel like it's a good lesson to kind of take in life in general when we're dealing with death and loss and grief. That's really the basis of this book, is it's trying to paint a story that illustrates the horror of grief itself and how sometimes it is too much for us to bear. Other things that I liked about the book, I liked the setting. Again, Stephen King is great at the details, the descriptions. So imagining the setting, like an older house kind of in the middle of nowhere, but in front of a busy street next to some creepy woods. I mean, that's kind of fun to imagine. I won't go into too much detail and describe what happens to certain characters, but the way the characters are described at the end, I thought was really creepy. Church, if you know, you know. If you've read the book, then you know who Church is. I think that he was really creepy and I liked him. And if you've also read the book, then you know about Lewis's last happy memory, which I also really liked the way that that was described. So things that I didn't really like, I will say that I personally felt like it was too long in some ways and not long enough in other ways. The book is 395 pages, I believe. Yes, 395. But the main events, like when it really starts picking up, is in the last like 100 pages. And it really doesn't even pick up even then until like the last 20 to 30 pages. So it's a pretty long book for the main events to happen within like this part of the book. I didn't really like that. There was at one point when I was kind of like, all right, let's get it going. I'm ready to like know what happens. So that's like my main complaint. Again, it's still very descriptive, so Stephen King adds those details for a reason because it creates a vivid story to imagine. But I do wish that, not necessarily that the first like parts before the main events would be shorter, but that the main events would be a little bit longer. I just feel like it was a lot of buildup, and it's not like there wasn't a good climax to the story, because there was. I especially really like the ending and how it's kind of left up for interpretation, but I do wish that there would have just been a little bit more action or drama. Again, that's just my own personal opinion. I just feel like it kind of dragged on for a little bit too long in some ways. Also, this might be a little bit of a spoiler, I'm not sure, but there is mention of a Wendigo, which, if you know what a Wendigo is, very creepy creature. There is mention of a Wendigo, but I feel like it's not really tied into the story that well. It's kind of just like an added creepy element for like the suspense. I wish that that could have been tied in a little bit more, but sometimes Stephen King does that, where he kind of just adds like a creepy element but doesn't really fully like bring it into the story in a more like integrated way. So maybe that's just part of his style. The other thing, which I don't know if anybody could agree with this, but it's something that I noticed. While this book is kind of like a horror book for grief and death, I feel like the main character, Lewis, I feel like his grief isn't really fully explained or described. It's almost like he acts out of his grief without thinking, but the actual emotional process of grief that he's experiencing isn't really described. Again, it's described in like the things that he does, like the explanation for his decisions in the book could be explained and attributed to his grief, but the actual inner emotional processes that he's undergoing isn't described, which I think is kind of interesting that it is a horror book about grief, but I feel like that inner, very personal experience that we all go through when we grieve, like that isn't really fleshed out. As descriptive as Stephen King is, I feel like the descriptions with that experience wasn't really given. But overall, I mean, it's still a good book. I would recommend it to people to read it if you're into Stephen King, and if you've never read this book, I would definitely recommend it, especially if you're interested in subjects related to like death and loss and grief. I mean, you'll like this book because that's really what it's about. And I really like the lesson that it teaches, that sometimes dead is better. I did enjoy reading it, and I'm curious to hear what everybody else has to say about this book if you've read it. If you haven't read it, I recommend you read it. Let me know what you guys think, and I will see you next time.